For centuries, African labour has fueled the wealth and development of Europe and the Americas. Initially, this was done through the brutal transatlantic slave trade, where millions of Africans were forcibly taken to work on plantations in the US, the Caribbean and South America. However, as the abolition of slavery swept through the world in the 19th century, a new system of exploitation emerged. Rather than forcefully taking Africans, Europe and the US devised a more sophisticated way to extract African talent, labour and resources, the modern immigration system, underpinned by strong passports and powerful currencies like the dollar and euro. Today, highly qualified Africans strive to reach the US and Europe not through force, but because of economic disparities and systemic global inequalities. This video explores how slavery transitioned into a more covert system of economic dominance that continues to siphon Africa's most valuable resource, its people. Before we proceed, please take a few seconds and click the subscribe button below to join this history community. Slavery in the US and Europe relied heavily on forced labour, with no regard for the humanity of the enslaved Africans. After the abolition of slavery, many Western nations faced a labour shortage. Despite the official end of the transatlantic slave trade, Africa continued to be viewed as a source of labour, wealth and exploitation. The introduction of passports in the late 19th and early 20th centuries laid the foundation for a new form of control. Unlike slavery, where individuals were physically captured and transported, passports restricted and regulated the movement of people across borders, creating a legal framework that benefited Western countries. Passports were initially designed to control immigration and labour flows in the wake of industrialization. Europeans, benefiting from imperialist ventures, solidified their economies and political power through colonization, with Africa at the centre of this exploitation. While African nations gained independence in the mid-20th century, the global economic system had already been structured in such a way that Africans, unable to find sustainable economic opportunities at home, began to look toward the West. The passport, once a tool of control, now became a key to accessing better opportunities abroad. But only a select few were allowed in. Currency has always been a significant instrument of power in international relations. The US dollar, backed by the economic and political might of the United States, and the euro, reflecting Europe's dominance, became new tools for global control. In the past, slaves provided free or cheap labour, but in the modern era, Africa's wealth is continuously extracted through unequal financial systems. The strong dollar and euro mean that countries in the US and Europe can offer far higher wages than those found in Africa, attracting Africa's best and brightest. This is a form of brain drain where skilled professionals, doctors, engineers, scientists and intellectuals leave Africa in search of higher pay and better living conditions in the West. While this migration might appear voluntary, it is driven by systemic inequalities that leave Africans with little choice. The infrastructure and opportunities in African countries are deliberately stunted by centuries of colonization, exploitation and, more recently, unfair economic policies imposed by international organizations dominated by the West, such as the International Monetary Fund, IMF, and the World Bank. In the past, the West came to Africa for cheap labor. Now, the brightest minds from the continent are eager to go to the West. They are not forced on slave ships, but they are compelled by the harsh economic realities created by global financial systems. Highly qualified Africans are desperate to leave their countries, not because they do not love their homeland, but because their talents are not appreciated or adequately rewarded at home. The West, with its strong currencies, presents a greener pasture, but this system continues the legacy of exploitation. When African professionals migrate to the West, their skills contribute to the development of their host countries, often leaving a vacuum in their home nations. For instance, African doctors working in Europe and America often cannot practice in their countries due to lack of resources, equipment and fair pay. This is compounded by the fact that Western governments actively recruit African talent, offering visas, better wages and opportunities that are unavailable in Africa. African countries, already weakened by economic policies that favor the West, lose their intellectual capital to Europe and America, perpetuating a cycle of dependency. The current immigration system is highly unequal. Western countries, particularly the US and Europe, use their immigration policies to attract the most qualified professionals from developing countries, especially Africa. Countries like the US issue H-1B visas that target skilled workers, particularly in the tech industry, while European countries offer similar programs. For the average African, the chance of obtaining a visa to work in these countries is incredibly slim, but for the highly skilled, the door is open. This selective migration means that the West is actively choosing who to admit, ensuring that they continue to benefit from Africa's human resources without having to deal with issues such as poverty or overpopulation. This mirrors the selective extraction of slaves during the transatlantic slave trade, where only the healthiest and strongest were taken. Now, it is not physical strength, but intellectual capacity that is being extracted. Meanwhile, African nations are left with a brain drain problem, where their most educated citizens leave for better opportunities, while their economies continue to struggle. The African continent is rich in natural resources, but without the intellectual capital to manage and innovate, these resources remain underexploited or sold off at a fraction of their value, often to Western companies. The role of global financial institutions like the IMF and World Bank in perpetuating this economic imbalance cannot be overlooked. These institutions, dominated by the US and Europe, impose austerity measures and loan conditions on African countries that prioritize debt repayment over infrastructure, education, or healthcare investment. As a result, African countries remain economically stunted, forcing qualified professionals to seek opportunities abroad. The strong currencies of the dollar and euro give Western countries an advantage in dictating the terms of global trade and finance, ensuring that African nations remain dependent. For example, many African nations are required to repay massive debts in foreign currencies, most often the dollar. This depletes local reserves and limits domestic spending, which could otherwise go into improving local economies and creating jobs. As a result, African governments struggle to retain their best talent, and professionals have no choice but to leave. The system is designed to keep Africa dependent and constantly supplying the West with labor and intellectual resources, much like during the era of slavery. In the era of slavery, chains were physical. Today, they are invisible but no less effective. The economic systems of the US and Europe, bolstered by their strong currencies and immigration policies, ensure that Africa continues to serve the West. While Africans are no longer forcibly taken on ships, they are lured by the promise of a better life in countries with stronger currencies. This modern exploitation takes a different form, but serves the same purpose, ensuring that the wealth and prosperity of the West remain at the expense of Africa. Slavery may have officially ended, but its legacy persists in more subtle and sophisticated ways. The US and Europe have replaced the chains of slavery with the allure of strong currencies and passports, attracting Africa's most qualified individuals while leaving the continent impoverished and dependent. This system is designed to maintain global inequality, where the wealth and resources of Africa continue to be extracted by the West, not through force, but through economic disparity and global financial dominance. The strong dollar and euro, along with immigration policies that favor skilled African professionals, ensure that the West remains the ultimate beneficiary of Africa's wealth, even in the modern era. This is the new face of exploitation, and it is as deeply entrenched as the slavery system that preceded it. If you found this video informative, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more content on history and human rights.